Welcome to Uncovered. I'm Jarrod Kibber. Bharat Sundaresan. I don't know where he is. Look, you're just going to have to heckle him on Twitter until he comes back on. What is it, Beastie Boy 07? I suggest, daily messages on Twitter. Is he on Instagram? He's probably on Instagram. Yeah, he's on Instagram as well. Annoy him there as well until he comes along. No, he's just having some issues, but I mean, not like issues. Well, I mean, he might be having some issues, but he couldn't get on. Is the point? And I'm still trying to recover from essentially covering 2 test matches overnight at the same time. Even huge thanks to the New Zealand and Australian batters for making them just far shorter than they needed to be. But I don't know if I've ever done that before. That sort of, what would I have been on? Like a 10, 12, 14-hour cycle, probably. So yeah, it was all a bit intense and everything else. So we will soldier on without Bharat here today, but plenty to talk about. I mean, the idea of Uncovered, of course, is to look at the, what's been going on in cricket over the last couple of days, and there is plenty to go with there. So Bharat, just abuse the man. Tell him that his hair isn't as silky smooth as he thinks it is. But this is Uncovered with Jarrod Kimber and not the other guy. All right, let's start with India-Australia. I think that's the more interesting of the 2 test matches. Although in the end, I think I saw less of it. Well, actually, I watched the Australia innings, but I watched it afterwards because there was like a gap between the 2 test matches. And I thought I'd have a quick sleep and I'd get up. And sometimes what I do is I kind of record the cricket and then watch it, with the old TiVo fast forward style 30-second thing. So you can catch up very quickly and watch a whole day's play. And also you can, it's probably a better way of actually watching it sometimes because you see the patterns of each delivery over and over again. Although it doesn't work as well with spin. That's a whole subplot. The point is that I wasn't expecting Australia to lose quite so dramatically. There's a new video up about India at home. I think the interesting thing for me is that, these teams keep turning up. So Australia, New Zealand, England. I'm trying to think who else has played in India of recent times, but over the last 2 or so years, and we keep focusing on how all these teams are not particularly good at playing spin and are struggling in these conditions, and there's all sorts of talks about the pitches and everything, but the overwhelming pattern at the moment is that India is just so much better than everyone else. And I think a lot of people got upset when I said that India was the best team in the world, even after New Zealand beat them in the World Test Championship, despite the fact I don't think that means that New Zealand weren't worthy winners. We saw the 2021 World Cup. England didn't win that. I still thought they were the best team in that tournament. That's how tournament play goes. That's how one-off games happen. Injuries, selection, all those things play a huge part in a one-off victory. But the more you delve into India's numbers, the more it's just incredible. I think someone might have asked the question on the latest wagon wheel of where this fits into the greatest home runs of all time. And it's certainly right up there. It's probably the best home run we've seen since Australia's home run. And then, of course, there's the West Indian one. I'm trying to think if England had one. I don't think England ever did. I think Australia probably always chipped in with the odd victory, just to keep them honest. There was certainly a period very early on in cricket, when England started. Australia did very well in the early contests, and then England started picking their better teams from all the players available to them, and they certainly got back on top for a little while. But quickly after that, Australia sort of came back in. So, if you're looking at something fairly historic here, I think when you look at Indian cricket, and the interesting thing is, I don't feel that most Indian fans are kind of understanding what they're seeing. I feel like there's a lot of Indian fans who are still looking at the negatives rather than being like, this is the best generation of Indian cricket we've ever seen. Okay, you're upset that KL Rahul is no longer in the team. Is still in the team, and you don't think he should be. I mean, that's the biggest issue you have. It's sensational, really. And it takes me back to I do think that there is something slightly different about the, having lived through the Australian era and now living through the Indian era. There was a real strong sense, and I think this probably came from Alan Border and his personality, and also the way he would talk about cricket as a captain, which was we had to struggle for everything we got, and so we should be thankful for kicking everyone's asses. I think by the mid 2000s, that's when you start getting the articles everywhere saying, "Is Australia winning too much and ruining world cricket?" But it does take a long time for that that to kick in. Whereas with India, it's kind of almost been instantaneous. There's been this obsession with how they do in the SENA countries. There's been this almost obliteration of the fact that this is by far and away the best bowling attack that India has ever had. That should almost be on every conversation. There's still this sort of looking back at the glory era of the Indian batting lineup. And I think you could make a fairly solid claim that the Indian batting lineup, even if you adjust for the fact that no one's making runs anymore, and so these batters look worse than they probably are, and a lot of that great Indian batting lineup batted throughout one of the greatest batting periods of history. Even if you adjust for that, I still think that older Indian batting lineup was slightly stronger, but they didn't have an all-rounder, let alone two other all-rounder lights that allowed them to bat to number 9 or 10, or sorry, 8 or 9. I suppose they could bat to 9 or 10. I think I put out an Indian 11 where you could bat to 9 or 10 recently. So it's possible, which again shows you just how much incredible flexibility they have that they didn't have in that other era. And even if that batting was slightly better, Srinath is a fine bowler. I'm not sure how he fits into this. He would even fit into this current lineup. Anil Kumble, perhaps because he's a wrist spinner, might be the third spinner in this situation. And also, that not quite as good a batter as maybe someone like Akshar Patel, but not far away, that kind of level again. So I think from that perspective, and Harbhajan Singh, very, very good bowler, but he's sort of that Stuart Broad level of bowler where, their overall numbers are absolutely incredible. And I don't think you should ever, talk down about them, but also that they got dropped during their career. This is not an all-time great level player, but Harbhajan was incredible. And what would he be? He might be the third best finger spinner if he was playing in India now, maybe the fourth best. That's how strong this current lineup is. And that's one thing that I think that a lot of fans have not really come to grips with. And perhaps, I did this for another article recently. It might have been about the World Cup article, India's World Cup campaign. When you look at Indian cricket and you look at the Indian population, it's such a young population that they didn't have to go through as many as the struggle years as other people did. And so they don't realize how important this is, I think, in a way that you could really notice in New Zealand, when New Zealand, even when they were starting to rise, even from 2015 onwards, New Zealand people, even younger New Zealand people, are like, this is special. This is not something that has happened very many times in our history. And then by the end, I've had fights with Jeremy Coney about this. I'll try and get him on the podcast one day so we can have a good argument about it. But I think by the end, it would be hard to argue that wasn't the greatest era of New Zealand cricket, even if pound for pound, maybe Jeremy Coney's team could have, would have given that New Zealand team a good run for its money. I still think that just on test basis alone, that was the best team. I think also it happened to coincide with probably being the best white ball team as well. So, from that perspective, New Zealand fans really seem to get it in a way that Indian fans just don't. It's really interesting to me watching it from that perspective and there's a few of the, I'm trying to think of the right word, Indian supremacists. So when Australia was on top, that was the big thing in Australia. So many Australian cricket fans became Australian supremacists of, we got kicked around the mud for so long, and now we're going to kick everyone else around the mud, and it's going to be awesome. What we didn't get in Australia was as many people who were just like, there are issues here, we're not doing this right, blah, blah. In fact, in Australian cricket, it's part of the reason I became a cricket writer is because no one was looking at the team from a critical point of view at all, even when they were losing series, even when there were issues, because you just had to kind of agree with everyone that they were the absolute best. Whereas with India, it almost feels to be the overwhelming, and this could just be cricket Twitter and cricket social media and, those sorts of places. But it does feel that the overall arching thing is that the Indian team would be far better if like one batter came in for another batter. And it's just like, it's very rare in the history of cricket that those decisions change things. As to go back to Nathan Lehman, the England analyst, it's like mostly the top 8 players essentially pick it themselves. You might pick one player based on form, one player picked based on conditions. And then, the other players touch and go between where you go, and you might go with someone who's a little bit more rounded rather than someone who's a single skill person, whatever that may be. It's the top 8 that win you the games, right? They're the ones who are going to face the most balls and bowl the most balls and everything else. So it is really interesting to me that that this has become such a polarizing time when realistically India is just awesome. Now, I think part of the polarization, which almost has nothing to do with Test cricket, of course, is that they have underperformed at World Cups, and I've certainly, you can go back and follow my writing and my video essays on that to have a look at the thought process behind all that. But what I would say is that it's just a brilliant team. I love the way it works. I love the combinations. I think one reason that Shardul was someone who was so interesting to me as a cricketer is that sort of Tim Bresnan. Trying to think of who else. Andrew Symonds like role, and he's not as good a cricketer as Tim Bresnan or Andrew Symonds. Certainly Tim Bresnan before his elbow fell apart. Anyway, but that kind of, when you have the ability to play a player like that and put them in a position to succeed, even though realistically they're not in the 20 or 30 most talented players in your country, but they fit a particular role at that time. And you have the ability to almost carry them, but use them successfully. I've said this a lot about Stuart McGill over the years. Like, Stuart McGill, had he played every Test match, would have ended up with quite a poor record. But Australia was so strong, they could pick Stuart McGill when they needed to. And you look at Mike Hussey, Stuart Clark, guys who had incredible records. Well, I saw both of them playing in their early 20s. They wouldn't have had great records if they'd started playing earlier on. Stuart Clark was a bit all over the shop at times and a lot faster as a bowler. And Mike Hussey is another perfect example of a cricketer that this whole thing about him knocking on the door for years. No, he was dropped by Western Australia. So I think that in that case, there's actually just a real, for me as an analyst, it's a really exciting time for Indian cricket. And when I looked at the World Cup teams, the flexibility and the range of different playing styles that they can use from one squad in a World Cup, I think is absolutely incredible. So no, they're really good. If you want to have a look at anything else about the how hard it is to bat in India at the moment, just done a big video about that. There's an article up as well. The other note I had from India's game was Virat Kohli's form. I thought he saw the ball very, very well. I love the way he played Lion early on. That sort of moving across and back, and picking the gap. That's kind of it's almost like the way that South Africans used to play off spin. I always thought South Africans, they had that period of Callis, Amla. I'm trying to think who the other guy was. It might have been AB as well, where they just had this ability to score almost at will against off spin deliveries in a way that meant that the off spinners had lost a lot of their power. I think, finger spinners in general, part of their overall skill is the ability to keep you on strike for longer than probably most forms of bowlers. I think, a lot of the most hard to score players in history have been, finger spinners over the years. I think of Lance Gibbs and let's say Hugh Tayfield. Is it Hugh Tayfield? I mean, the South African. I always forget his name. You see some of those off spinners and really good at sticking up an end. And if you have that ability to score off them naturally, and what he did was, of course, Virat was he either came very far forward or went very far back. I think, again, if you look at some of the times where he was struggling against spin, it was probably in that middle area where you're playing a little bit more from the crease rather than, going back into the crease or coming quite forward. And all the analytics now, and, you can talk to any good player of spin throughout the history of cricket, and they'll tell you the same thing. You either want to have your inception point as far forward as possible or as far back as possible. And I think watching Kohli, be interesting to see if that was something that changed there. But I mean, India won very easily. I thought the whole Travis Head thing was absolutely fascinating from an Australian point of view. You have someone who they probably weren't going to take on the tour. They probably took on the tour as much as anything because wanted to get him some time in the nets, get used to playing in Asia. Eventually, he's going to have to play in Asia more, right? Even if it's not against India, it's going to be against someone. They need him to play better against spin. They specifically need him to play better against off spin. And then there was that rumor before the match that he might open the batting. And I thought that was a really, really interesting thought process. My first other than the fact that it caused issues with Warner and Khawaja, obviously. My first thought was, that's probably not a bad idea. We see him in the middle order. It was a very odd innings in the first one. Missed a lot of balls against Ashwin on the, if I remember correctly, though, on the inside part of his bat. I think a lot of them hit his pad. A lot of scrambling around the crease, but then, was done in by a very good ball from, I think it was Shami, wasn't it? Maybe around the wicket. Not moving his feet, kind of just poking at the ball a little bit outside off stump. Really interesting that he would go out to a seam bowler. But then the second innings, look, he backed himself. I think you can probably get away with that for a short period of time. And my theory was always that he might not last long on day 2 if he kept going the same way. And it's a little bit like Alex Carey. We saw Alex Carey try that in the first innings. And there's kind of, the pitches are too in favor of the spinners, and the spinners are too good for, I think, you to play in a reckless way for a long period of time. If you go back to, for instance, Adam Gilchrist in 2001, he did a very similar thing. He got away with it for a little bit longer, and I think the pitches were a little bit better, and the bowlers wasn't quite at this quality, although, as I said before, they were still brilliant bowlers. And I do believe that you can get away with it for a little period, but then eventually... And you see this is a very similar thing you see with seam bowling. You see people come to Australia quite often, and you'll get, a middle order player or even a tail ender will come out and they'll make a score in the first innings, that they play in a test match series, and then it will just disappear. And that's because they took a lot of risks, and they kind of, if anyone knows about boxing, they kind of did leading with their right hand. So, they kind of shock people by, punching them in the face, without doing any jabs. And over time, it doesn't really work. And Alex Carey did that, and now Travis Head's done that. That doesn't mean that Travis Head can't work it out. What I did like, though, is that first innings, I felt like it was just scratchy. Like he wasn't really sure what he was doing at all. I felt, at the very least, in that second innings, I was like, okay, well, he's decided that this is his plan. That's the first step, right, of actually understanding how you're going to try and score runs in any location. And the last thing I want to talk about was Nathan Lyon. I think we did the Uncovered last week, and probably the Wagon Wheel as well. And just so many people asking questions about is that the end for Lyon? He's no good and everything else. I think we've still see with Lyon, just he is a very, very talented bowler. I don't think the weird thing is, I don't think anything we saw from the last game to this game actually changes how I feel about Lyon. He's not ever going to be a consistently high wicket taking threat in Asia. But that doesn't mean we've certainly seen him take a lot of 5-wicket hauls in Asia. Doesn't he have he's got some weird stat where he's got the most 5-wicket hauls against India, I think, in Test cricket or something bizarre like that. But we also know there are going to be long periods of times when he doesn't do that. And I think he needs a particular kind of pitch that suits him. And I thought this pitch was just that little bit faster than the last one. I didn't look at any of the CricViz data, so I don't know if it spun more. Hawkeye data. I don't know if it spun more in this game than it did in the previous game. But it felt like it spun quicker. And I think, especially when Nathan Lyon was bowling in that last game, it didn't spin quicker. And because he is just a little bit slow, and we've seen him try and get quicker, but he still doesn't have that sort of natural pace. I feel like when he's bowling quicker, he's probably losing something else from his action in a way that, say, Jadeja isn't. But good for him for getting some wickets. And Kuhnemann did a fine enough job. What a weird way to do that. I probably won't ever do this, but I would love to go back and just write a book about all the weird Australian spinners who suddenly get thrown into a game in India. You could even do some, like Gavin Robertson coming back from retirement from club cricket. You got Bryce McGain when he didn't actually play and got injured on that tour. Obviously, Jason Frazier is kind of, the dude. I'm trying to think, was Colin Miller's first tests in India, or had he played before? He might have played before, but even his story is absolutely remarkable. He was probably this very weird aside here, but Colin Miller might have been the Australian spinner who was best suited to Asia, just because he was pretty fast, because he used to be a fast bowler, of course. Well, medium fast. Let's be fair. All right, we'll take a break here. And after the break, we'll cover a little bit of New Zealand, England here on Uncovered with Jarrod Kimber and Blank.
You're listening to Cricket's Conversation on 99.94. Whatever your team, we have the show for you on podcast, YouTube, or on the 99.94 app. We have India, England, South Africa, West Indies, and now Sri Lanka covered. If you want to find us, the best way is to follow us on social media at 9994DM by downloading the 9994 app or Google 99.94 on podcast. We speak cricket.
All right, welcome back. Remember, if you, especially if Barrett's not around, if you want to ask any questions and you're in the YouTube, feel free to pop them through. I've seen there's a couple of super chats, which I'll get to in a little while, but anyone else put a question in, and if it's for me, I will get to it. So where are we? New Zealand, England, that's where I was. Yeah, I thought one of the most interesting things for me on that whole New Zealand, England, well, the New Zealand side of the New Zealand, England series is just how poor that bowling attack of New Zealand was. They had five, well, if you want to count Darren Mitchell, they had 6 bowling options in their team. And you would say that as it currently stands, there's only one dead certainty, which is Tim Southee. Neil Wagner, he had a bizarre game because he took wickets in the first innings, but he bowled really bad at times in that first innings. In the second innings, he took a couple as well, but ended up with their second most expensive figures in the history of Test cricket in runs per over. It really was just an absolutely batshit game. And then after him, you had Blair Tickner, who I'm assuming they like his pace, but it feels like to me it takes him a long time to get up to that pace. He has to try very, very hard in a way that, you know, maybe some other fast bowlers around the world do not. And if he's not really getting any pace off the wicket, he doesn't move the ball sideways all that much. He's not particularly accurate because of his action. He's got an incredibly club cricket action. Just it just feels like, you know, you take 20 k's an hour off him and he's, you know, bowling first change in a club game in Otago. You're really interesting watching him come in. He just doesn't come in like a professional bowler. Then you've got Scott Kugelheim, who, you know, on moral reasons, people have a lot of questions about him, but I actually thought he probably bowled better in this game than I thought he was capable of. But you know, there's not a lot to his bowling. Again, not very accurate. Roughly the same pace as Tickner, so not fast enough to really scare top level players, but also, you know, not medium fast or fast medium. He has the ability to touch fast when he has to, but not consistently for sure. Has the weirdest tick I have ever seen. This is only going to work if anyone's on YouTube watching it. So sorry to everyone listening to this later on the podcast, but he puts the ball in his fingers as deliberate as I've ever seen anyone. And then he holds it up really closely to his face, which means that there's no way the batter can't see any detail of it. The other thing is, because it's a pink ball, he can see exactly if he's going to bowl a cross seam delivery, or he's going to try a wobble ball, or he's going to try, you know, swing it, or whatever he's going to do. And then he runs in presenting the ball the entire time. I'm trying to think of Brett Lee, Chris Wokes. I can't think of too many bowlers I've ever seen who are that deliberate. And I would say that Kugelheim was even further on that. But again, Blair Tickner was probably, if Blair Tickner was your 4th best bowler in a really strong bowling lineup, I don't think he would be seen as a problem. But being your 3rd best in a weaker bowling lineup was pretty bad. Kugelheim is a 5th bowler. Michael Bracewell is Michael Bracewell is a 5th bowler. I thought he did well in that second innings, but you know, he's a 5th bowler. He's handy and he can bat and he's still learning. There's a bit of Moeen Ali about him in that he has the ability to rip the ball like a frontline spinner, and he thinks like a batter, but he doesn't have the groove of Moeen Ali. And to be fair, anyone who watched early Moeen Ali, I think Moeen Ali, we're talking about finger spinners having a low runs per over. I think Moeen Ali has one of the highest runs per over of any finger spinner of all time. He's got an alarmingly high economy. And Bracewell's another one where once the batter works him out, I feel like they can score quite quickly. But because he does rip it, it's not like who's another sort of finger spin part-timer, 5th option type guy. I'm trying to think. We don't have many anymore. But he's not a roller. You know, he's not a bowler who comes in and just rolls the ball out of his fingers and he's going to be accurate and, you know, keep it in a good spot. He's legitimately trying to spin the ball. And that brings a lack of control sometimes. But it does allow him to be in a position where he can take wickets, but he should go for a lot of runs. But it's just considering we're just coming out of the New Zealand Golden era, and I know Kyle Jameson and Matt Henry were not available, but watching Kugelheim, Bracewell, and Tickner was startling for a team that not that long ago had probably the best pace bowling in the world. Well, Southey, Wagner, Bolt, Jameson. Yeah, okay. Even Colin de Graham with their little, fifth options. It's a huge step back. Like, I think had they played in this game, it would have been interesting to see how de Grandhomme did against, the Bazball style. But the other side of that is he might have been their third best bowler in this situation. So huge problem for them. Of course, they also didn't make any runs in New Zealand, which is not particularly good either. I thought they, who are they missing? They're missing BJ Watling, and they are missing Ross Taylor. Everyone else is there. They've still got Devon Conway. They got Latham. Will Young was not in this side, but they had Daryl Mitchell. They still have Henry Nichols. It's not exactly a bad batting lineup on paper, and yet kind of in both innings, and all credit goes to England. The three bowlers that England took in did not bowl many bad balls. In fact, they bowled some incredible deliveries. But I just didn't feel like there was any plan from New Zealand on how to get through other than you hopefully would nick a few. And it was very interesting in the second innings. I think Latham might have done it, but Daryl Mitchell continued to do it. We saw him do it in England as well, of coming down the crease a little bit at times, which is something that the England batters have started doing. And it's weird that I'll probably have to do a video on it and I'll try and get some footage of it to show you what I mean. But if you watch T20 cricket, one-day cricket now, it's very rare that someone comes down the wicket to a seam bowler. If you watched one-day cricket in the 90s, that was the fad, right? That's what you had to do. And it's really gone away, but it's become a thing. And I think it's probably Joss Butler, Ben Stokes. I'm trying to think who else might have. There was someone else I think involved in it in England, and I think they did it for different reasons as well, if I remember correctly. I think with Butler, he felt like, I have to go back and see if I can find an article about it. But I think with Butler, I think the idea was that when he was facing slower bowlers, he just wanted to kind of speed the game up a little bit. Whereas I think with Ben Stokes, it was probably more about a little bit of aggression. And then we've seen Zach Crawley do it. Did Ollie Pope might have done it as well? So there's some other players doing it because of LBWs and all these different reasons. But it's a very interesting thing. Watching Zach Crawley do it, I think, was absolutely fascinating because teams are working him out by bowling just that little bit shorter, knowing that he'll still drive anyway. So he's coming down the wicket to make that little length closer to where he would drive from, which means he's on the move, and he's not particularly. He's a bit big and clunky as a batter. So once he sort of gets down the wicket and starts to move, he kind of gets himself into the wrong positions. But yeah, I'm not saying New Zealand have to try something like that. And I think it was Conway might have been batting outside off stump at times in the second innings. That was the first time I thought, they're actually thinking about this. And they're not just allowing England to bowl to them. But just on England, we've seen them play so well for a long time. This is the first time that, kind of everything was in their favor. This is a test match you would have expected the old England to win, just because having Ollie Robinson, Stuart Broad, and Jimmy Anderson up against essentially Tim Southey and Neil Wagner with the pick ball is such a huge advantage to England. Now, obviously, they play their batting still played a big part of it, and the funky field placements and all these different things. They got the luckiest wicket I think I've ever seen, with Tim Southey managing to scoop a low full toss down the leg side to a fielder that happened to be 20 meters off the boundary for a hook shot. But yeah, they did all those sorts of little things. But I think this is more the kind of classical kind of England win, which I found very interesting. And then I suppose the other major thing is Harry Brook, who I think he's got a record of already the third or fourth most runs in his first 7 or 8 test innings or whatever it may be. But the way he is going about it, I remember I think it was Mike Atherton said it was the best young batter he'd seen since Ollie Pope. The minute I saw Harry Brook play, I thought this is the next generation of Joe Root. I'm still struggling to find a way that teams can get at him. I think the most obvious one should be short pitch bowling. And I want to see him in a prolonged period of time playing, really good short pitch bowling. And he did face short pitch bowling in this test, but it wasn't particularly good. And it also wasn't. It was kind of it always felt like it was from a position of weakness because England were generally on top in the game. I'd like to see him facing short pitch bowling on a slightly quicker pitch in a situation where England are struggling a little bit more. But it's beautiful to watch. If you haven't seen that straight drive that he plays, where he lofts the ball over long off for 6 so effortlessly. And there's a lot of people talking about KP. It's funny. I went back and I watched a bunch of KP shots, similar kinds of shots. And my first thought was that Harry Brook it looks cleaner when he does it. There was always an element with KP of sort of, there was extra movements that he didn't need to make, I think, at times. Whereas with Harry Brook, it's almost like a refined version of that. Maybe Harry Brook is like some weird combination of Joe Root and KP, but a fascinating player to watch. All right, we'll have one quick break here. And then after the break, I will come back. We'll talk about the Women's World Cup. And then I will get to your questions here on Uncovered with Jarrod, Kimber, and Blank. There is something wrong in the cricket world. And while it may not be a conspiracy, there does seem to be a movement towards leaving more grass on the wicket. And thusly, the global batting average has dropped. If a similar thing has happened to you in your personal life, try Manscaped. Their Lawnmower 4.0 will help you trim any unwanted pubic grass. And once your downstairs track is taken care of, you can also use Manscaped's liquid formulations. So before heading outside, use the Crop Preserver Ball Deodorant to stay cool in the heat. And if you've been playing too many games recently and you need some help with your strip, why don't you go and get their Crop Reviver? I think I may possibly have taken all of this analogy too far. But the point is, Manscaped sells items that allow you to shave your pubic itch pitch. Use the code REDINKER, all one word, which is the name of my podcast, and you can get a 20% discount and free worldwide shipping while you curate your special strip like a team of sweaty men hoping it doesn't rain. Beautiful. Yeah, so just on the Women's World Cup, actually, there's a game going on at the moment. So I was watching that. All Prendergast is she's someone I made a video about her batting, and I've been watching her in this tournament so far. Her fielding, she took a great catch today. Might have been the Mandana wicket, if you want to find the replay. I think it was out at deep point coming in. I thought she bowled really, really well. I think she can bowl better too. Some of her lines and lengths, I didn't really understand why she was bowling those lines and lengths. But she's sort of big and rangy with her bowling, and she can clearly bat and she can clearly field. I think she's a really, really exciting prospect going forward for Ireland women. It's incredible to see someone like her come through the system. And because Irish women's cricket really has kind of been stuck for a long time. And to see her coming through so quickly, she's 20 years old. Sorry, I'm just looking up her record. I couldn't remember how old she was. I knew she was young, but yeah, she's 20 years old. And in T20 cricket so far, she's averaging 23 with the bat, 24 with the bat, sorry. And she's averaging 23 with the ball. I just think it's huge for women's cricket to have someone like her coming through, someone as talented as her, from a place like Ireland. And we've already seen it with people like Sarah Boyce. I forgot the name of the woman who's been picked up in the women's IPL draft as well. You watch Fair Break as well, and you're seeing some of these players play. The Thai wicketkeeper whose name I can never ever remember. It's just such an exciting time for women's cricket, and I think it's good to see stories like All Prendergast, because probably as we sit here now, the 4 teams we thought that would make it through to the semi-finals are going to make it through the semi-finals, give or take South Africa. Early on in the tournament, it looked like Sri Lanka might be able to get one of the women's semi-final spots. They had they lost to Australia, which was fine, but I think they had quite a poor game against New Zealand. From I saw the hour-long replay of that one, so I didn't see the entire game. But I think they should be a little bit disappointed with themselves for that particular game. And of course, in the other one, I thought Ireland kept themselves quite well in this game against India. I see there's rain, but in that game as it currently stands. But, so Ireland still have a chance, I suppose, of coming back there. But I thought Ireland did quite well. But, England and India look like they're the most likely teams to qualify over there. It's fine. we're seeing it in the men's game as well. So it'd be unfair to pick on the women's game for a trend that we're certainly seeing within the men's game, which is, it doesn't matter how many teams you have in this World Cup. It looks like there's about 5 to 6 teams who are going to have a realistic chance of winning it. And with the women, it's probably going to be 3 to 4 at most. And that's just how these things go. But it would have been great if Sri Lanka could have held their nerve together a little bit longer, maybe at least put up a good game against New Zealand, got a little bit closer, because they're going to end up with a very bad net run rate now. And unless India do something silly in this game against Ireland, which, of course, by the time we record this, we might know more about, but India should probably win that one as well. But I just haven't seen as much of it. Trying to find hours to sleep last weekend were not particularly good. So I saw about I was watching the India Ireland game up until I came on to do this podcast. But I've really enjoyed what I've seen in the Women's World Cup. All right, let us have a look at a few questions from the comments. Pratik has a super chat. Remember, if you want something very, very different, if you want to guarantee your questions are answered on any of these things, usually when Barrett's around, it's a bit harder for us to answer, but when Barrett's not around, I can always do that. So you can always get a super chat on if you are definitely want your question answered, if you're in YouTube with us. And Pratik says, how are the Dukes, Kookaburra and SCG balls different over the course of a test innings? How does the surface affect each ball? So the balls are made for each surface. And so that's the one difference with Kookaburra, in that it is kind of more of a generic cricket ball, which is probably why it doesn't, I suppose Kookaburra is a bit more like a ball that is that you get off the rack, and the other balls are handmade and made specifically for the locations in which they are used, which means that Kookaburra is probably by design not going to be as good a ball as the other two are. Dukes is, there is, as far as I'm aware, there were 3 different versions of Dukes made. There's a West Indian version, Australian version, an English version. The Australian version's, I think, gone now that they don't use it in Shield cricket, but they had different lacquer and all those 3 different ones. As far as I'm aware, SG is only one kind of ball, but is obviously tailored towards one kind of market in India and I suppose Asia, but India is where it's used. So to begin with, they're very, very different. So Kookaburras usually would swing quite violently at the start. And SG balls are very similar with that. SG balls tend to reverse swing a little bit more, is what some people have said, and that they're a little bit more consistent in their reverse swing than a Kookaburra is. Kookaburras can go soft, and so even if you're going to get reverse swing, the ball gets a bit too soft and it doesn't quite work in the same way that it should be. The Dukes balls, they don't swing as much early on. So what happens with them is, as the lacquer comes off, they start to swing, and generally they swing a little bit more later on is the best way. They usually stay a little bit harder. I think that has to do with the lacquer directly. They stay a little bit harder, and they give you, like, do you remember the England? I'm trying to think. The England-New Zealand Test series of, was it before or after the World Test Championship? But must have been that summer. If you have a look, England and New Zealand were swinging the ball pretty much 70 overs of the game all the way through, and they were getting movement off the seam. The one difference at the moment between Kookaburra and the Dukes and the SG ball is the seam. So I think, and I haven't looked at this recently, so I don't know if SG have changed it, but the Kookaburra seam was reinforced and made better to mimic what the Dukes was doing. And that's why the wobble ball works a little bit better when you're using the Kookaburra now. So that was 2020, and you can go back and have a look. I did an article about how it changed one-day cricket and T20 cricket quite dramatically when they upgraded that ball. And I don't think there's been any changes to SG of recent times. So SG is kind of the least interesting ball, only because it's the only one used in one location, whereas Dukes, you have to take, being the Dukes is thought of as the best ball, and it's also been used in 3 different locations professionally, in 2 different locations internationally. That's the one, and I think it's just been ahead of the pack for a long period of time. Although I'm sure there's great balls out. So thank you, Pratik, for your super chat. Harsh says, lots of kangaroo journalists. started saying that we will thrash India on a neutral venue in World Test Championship. But what if it was held in Sri Lanka or UAE? Would they think the same? Or is it just to satisfy their audience? It's just what everyone says when they're losing. Every time I've ever seen India lose in Australia or England, I've seen the exact same things. And it's kind of boring and, predictable and silly, but it's a thing that people do now, and it seems to be, I don't know. I don't know. This sort of stuff just tires me, because it's like, okay, you're still losing now. Will you prepare properly for that? And Australia didn't win the last series against India at home, so I don't know what that really means. The Real Arm says, Jarrod, stat padding, this podcast hype. I love how we've got to the point on cricket Twitter where stat padding has become I want to talk about stat padding. Actually, that's kind of why I picked this. I don't really understand the sentence real AMs, if we're being honest, but stat padding is a really, really interesting thing. And I was talking, I can't remember who it was, but it was to an England player recently about this, about Jarrod Malan, all the England, there was an innings they played against South Africa. So it must have been the first ODI against South Africa. And we were on TalkSport commentating it, and we're getting so many people coming through going, oh, Malan, stat padding again. Look at him stat padding, playing for himself, blah, blah, blah. Of course, Malan went out and England lost the game. And they didn't lose the game because he was behind the rate either. It wasn't even that kind of situation. The game is played in runs, right? Stat padding is a slightly different thing. If you really talk about stat padding, what you're talking about is empty calories. So you're talking about the one-day players who end up at the top of the run leaderboards in T20 competitions, but have a strike rate of 115, 120, or they have a strike rate of 120 for most of the innings, and then they slog at the end so that it looks like their numbers are better, but they've actually put pressure on the rest of the team. That's a fair kind of stat padding. If you're just calling stat padding every time anyone makes runs, that's literally the job, is to try and make runs. And there are also going to be players who just struggle to score quickly when they first start their innings. Not everyone has the ability. We are a long way into T20 cricket, and Luke Ronchi still stands out massively as a player who had the ability to have a incredibly high strike rate from the start. I mean, you could argue that Chris Gayle stat padded because he had slow starts, but it's probably more just the fact that Chris Gayle just took 5 to 10 to 15 balls to really find his range. And I also think in Chris Gayle's case, it was also that they would quite often feed him a lot of fast bowlers early on, and he preferred to hit, fast medium fast bowlers or spinners. And so he was waiting for the correct matchup to come on and to attack. That was probably different in the beginning of his career. I was there when he hit Brett Lee out of the Oval twice, for instance. But towards the end, once he got over 32, 33, 34, he was really picking the matchups that he wanted. And that's not stat padding. Again, that's what you should do. A lot of baseball, if you actually what they're doing, is that it actually weirdly comes from the way that the West Indians play T20 cricket. Okay, this ball is in this area. I'm going to take this risk to give me the maximum chance of a reward. But it's actually far more robotic and mechanical than people understand. And there's still going to be players out there who have the ability to just turn the ball around. I don't know what that has to do with Real Am's question, but there we go. Bob says, probably one of my most disappointing days of cricket I've seen. Do you think Australia can bounce back for this in the next 2 tests or even for the Ashes? Oh, yeah. I mean, they bounced back from the last disappointing one to actually play pretty good at the start of this test match. I think there's something that we're definitely noticing a pattern with their spin bowlers, that they're so much better with the new ball than with the older ball. And that just might be that Jadeja's natural bowling is not as affected by the older ball. And Ashwin is such a smart thinker that, you quite often just see how often he changes theories, on a whim of, okay, I'm going to try this now, and I'm going to try this now, I'm going to try this now, in a way that Nathan Lyon would never be able to do. And so perhaps, if Australia had those two kinds of bowlers, they would be in a better situation in this test. They might have had a 50 to 100 run lead, and, they would have kept themselves in the match for a little bit longer. Maybe even, won the game. But what I've just said is, maybe if they had two of the best spin bowlers and perhaps the best spin partnership we've ever had in Test cricket together, that they would be better. They don't have that, right? They have two kids who are learning on the job and another guy who's safe and steady pair of hands. So I'm not too worried. I thought Australia would probably lose the series 3-1. With the change of venues, I probably would have updated that to 4-0. But a lot of that is just based on the fact that India is really good, and we really have to we do have to accommodate for that. What I would say so far is that in both of these test matches, Australia has been in the game. And we tend to focus on the fact that it's gone really badly for them at the end. And that's absolutely fine, because over the course of 5 days, but over the course of, I don't know, 2.5 days, 4 days, India is quite clearly the better team. But this is not a situation where Australia has not had chances. They had a chance to stay within their game in that first test, probably from a slight position behind, but still stay within the game. And they certainly had a position here. This is not a position where they've been blown completely off the map from the first ball in both games. And, if they can manage 2 innings in a game, they give themselves a chance of at least fighting with India. And at the moment, that's probably, India doesn't even need to bat. Well, I was going to say doesn't need to bat in the second innings, but hasn't really even needed to complete, a full second innings yet, right? Emma says, how many decades would it take to produce a pace trio like Jarrod, Ashwin, and Akshar? I think we've had hundreds of them, haven't we? West Indies probably had those bowlers. I'd have to go back and have a look at the averages, but yes, West Indies certainly had those. Australia, what's Australia's best 3-prong? Well, I mean, Gillespie, Warne, McGrath. That doesn't count, does it? Because Warne's not a spinner. I mean, not a seamer. I think we've had really, really good attacks like this before when it comes to seam bowling. So it's the one different thing. This is really, really interesting, because it almost doesn't count, because we actually have a seam bowling trio at the moment, which is Hazelwood, Stark, and Cummins. Stark might be moving beyond his best, but at his absolute best, 2 of them could bat. Obviously, Hazelwood couldn't. I don't think they could quite bat on that level. And I don't know if you do mean batting as well, but that's the one difference with spinners. The kind of athletes who end up being spinners generally throughout the history of the game have the ability to perhaps bat a little bit better, whereas being a fast bowler, perhaps because of your longer limbs, perhaps because it's such a different physicality to batting and spin bowling, there doesn't seem to be as much overlap in those sorts of positions. It might also be selection bias, because especially in Western cricket, I think teams have generally tried to pick their spinner who can help a little bit with the bat, whereas that's usually not something that teams look at when they're looking at seam bowlers. So I don't know if selection bias plays a part in that, but no, we certainly had pace trios like Jadeja, Ashwin, and Akshar. If this question is particularly about Indian cricket, I mean, they've just got their best bowling lineup ever in seam bowling. So it's going to take a long time before you can develop. Think about all the institutional knowledge that needs to go into being someone like R. Ashwin. He does not come on his own. And if you think about that from an institutional knowledge point of view, then you go to Jadeja, who is a world-class athlete, like most of our best all-rounders have probably been. I don't think it's I don't know if I've ever covered this before, but I don't think it's an accident that Keith Miller and Ian Botham both played professional football. There is certainly something about all-rounders and athleticism that is really, really important. Again, to be a player with as well-rounded and be in a system as good as Jadeja is to get the absolute most out of him, all these things take a long period of time. So if that's an Indian-based question, I don't know what your answer is, but it's always going to be tougher when because seam bowlers develop in such a weird, stilted way in Asia. It would be like, if you look at South African cricket over the last couple of years, their bowling stocks are probably as deep as India's. And it's the first time that their bowling stocks includes having 3 test quality spin bowlers available to them. Shamsi, I think, has a better first class bowling average than Maharaj or Harmer. And obviously Harmer's a fantastic bowler, and we haven't even seen that much of him international level. Maharaj has done very, very well. And then you've got the incredible seam bowlers, and of which there are too many to name. Why did they have 3 spin bowlers at this time? Well, the wickets have started to change. So it really, a lot of these things do require on wickets. And if you go back to, we talked about whether Jadeja and Ashwin was the best spin bowling pairing of all time. So the other obvious one to go back to is Clary Grimmett and Bill O'Reilly. And when they played together, Australian wickets were completely different, right? And they also allowed for 2 different kinds of leg spinners. Whereas now, as we saw with McGill and Warne, that's not what Australian wickets are anymore. So the conditions play such a huge part when you're talking about developing people over a long period of time. Jimesh says, you may have already answered this, but I just joined, so let me ask you again. Where's Bharat? I don't know, man. Hit him up on Twitter, ask him where he is. He's supposed to be here. Absolute bludger. Nikon says, are the commentators today more biased than earlier? So many great players sound like cheerleaders for their team rather than analysts of the game. I don't think they're more biased than ever. I mean, I grew up under Channel 9. It would be hypocritical of me to say that modern commentators are more biased than the commentators I grew up with. They were the biggest cheerleaders ever. My favorite Channel 9 comment was when Ian Healy, I think it was Ian Healy, I might have been Slats. It was Healy or Slats, was trying to explain Dale Steyn to an Australian audience. And he said, he's kind of like the James Pattinson of South African cricketer, the leader of their attack. Oh, yeah. The amount of times that we've compared Dale Steyn to James Pattinson over the years. To be fair, James Pattinson was in good form at that time, but he barely played, and Dale Steyn was Dale Steyn. So I grew up with that. So I would never say that they're more biased now. I do think there are some players who have come through. Let me take a back step. Some of the best playing commentators we've ever had journalistic backgrounds. So, Richie Benaud, Christopher Martin. Well, actually, Christopher Martin Jenkins is not a player, is it? But Ian Chappell had a journalistic background. There are some others out there as well who wrote proper columns from around the world. Even someone like Sunil Gavaskar, wrote his own book, so he had to write. There's a discipline in that is completely lost to modern commentators. They come straight off out of being in the team, and I've worked with a lot of famous former players, and especially when they first start commentating, they'll be like off mic. They'll be like, "This guy, blah 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 blah." You get them on mic, and you ask them a safe question about the same topic, and they'll be like, "No, he's fine." And you're like, "What? This what?" And it's because they don't want to break those relationships, and Mitchell Johnson talked about it on his podcast with Bharat, where it's a real issue when he spoke out, and he was even a few years taken away from the game. And so there is a part of that. There is also a part of it that you're probably going to get more work from your local area. But I really think it's a combination of about 3 different things. One, we don't have professional commentators. And what I mean by that is, in most sports, you have people who commentate 7 to 8 months of the year. That is their job. They're trained by a broadcaster. They think about it as a broadcaster. Even if they don't come from a journalistic background, they have really strong editorial control, all these sorts of things. Cricket commentators, you get some work, then you don't get any work for 4 months. Then you do 3 tournaments in a row. Then you don't get any work for 6 months. And you're not a professional commentator in the same way. There aren't many Simon Doull, Ian Bishop type people out there. That's a real issue for learning the skills. And it also means that quite often when they're not commentating, they're not watching all the games, right? That's not what they do. The other thing is that editorial control of cricket commentary has, in my experience, never been particularly good. I'd say it's a lot worse in TV than it is in radio, weirdly enough, which doesn't really make any sense, because you should want the product to be even better in TV. But in TV, they just want famous names, and they just don't work on them very well. If you go back and you listen to when Channel 9 was a great commentary, and you talk to people like Chappelli and Mark Nicholas, they'll say that the editorial control was so strict. And that in modern cricket doesn't happen. generally people are afraid to tell famous ex-players that they're being lazy or that they haven't done a good stint, or they don't educate them. They just bring players straight in from teams, and then the player has to kind of sink or swim. And I think the third one is that players don't really see it, former players, I should say, don't really see it as a hard job. They see it as the cushiest job ever. I've had so many former players tell me that. And I always say, well, if you think it's the cushiest job ever, that just means you're not doing it very well. It means that they're just getting by on the fact that they were former players and that they're famous, and that, you know, maybe they can crack a couple of jokes, and occasionally they'll go, oh, have a look at this guy's footwork. You should be doing the work. And the only other thing I would add is I just don't think there is a level of in American sports, and I don't know if this happens in football and other major European sports, but in American sports, you quite often you meet the coaches and the key players before the game, and you can say to them, oh, I don't know anything about this kid. Tell me about this kid. Or, you know, what style have you guys been running recently? Or I caught this game the other day and this guy was doing this. The very good commentators I've worked with, and Steve Harmison and Darren Goff, are really natural at this. I think because they're naturally social people. They will go out in the ground and they'll talk to people. Ian Bishop is another one. I remember Ian Bishop drilling me, and Dirk Nannis drilling me for information when I was working for Scotland, right? Trying to find out more and more information so they can do it. But a lot of commentators don't do that. They don't turn up on practice days. They don't turn up early and ask questions. And so I think the overall quality of commentary is, I think that cricket has moved forward massively over the last couple of years. Professionalism in cricket in so many different ways. I don't think commentary has, and I think it's a real shame. And I think there's much better ways of being able to do things. So far, hasn't quite worked that way. Do I think they're more biased? I think all cricket media is more biased now than it was before, but I think that is because all media is more biased now than it was before. So it's almost a separate question for you, Nikon. I think newspapers now are a lot more biased than they were 20 years ago. But in some ways, it's harder to be more biased now in cricket, because in the old days, Malcolm Conn could write whatever he wanted and no one would ever read it. And these days, you know, you read Malcolm Conn from today and you read him from 15 years ago, he's pulling that's unfair to him. He's not as bombastic as he used to be. And that's because if you do, you spend all your time on social media getting abused. You have to be a lot more factual and everything else. But the bias in a general sense, I would say that even in press boxes, when I first started, if anyone clapped in a press box, they were poo-pooed. I would say that now there's a lot more people, more like me, who are fans of the game, who happen to be good at broadcasting or writing or anything else, working in press boxes. And then there's a few countries where that's actually like part of the thing. The Bangladesh journalists are the most fanny journalists that you can come across. They ride every ball. And perhaps it's just because they're younger. I'm not sure what the difference is there. But yeah, I do feel like it's different. And I do think commentary is changing, and I hope that it can change for the better going ahead. But I don't know if I would sit there and go, it's more biased. Of all the things that I would levy at it, I'm not sure that's particularly the case. Munfifth says, opinion on KS Bharat. Do you think his batting will hold up while touring, or will England go with the wicketkeeper who bats better? Well, obviously, Rishabh Pant will come back, hopefully, when he can. So KS Bharat is, for me, he's almost like an ideal backup, right? In that he's probably not going to confuse you and make you feel like you need anyone else, but you're also going to know whether, what you're trying to work out with KS Bharat is whether he's Ben Folkes, right? And that's kind of a perfect situation to be in. I was talking about this with a coach recently of, I almost think the ideal team going forward has two wicket keepers, right? You have your batting wicket keeper who probably plays 70% of the time. And then you have your specialist wicket keeper who plays as a backup player, but also in conditions when you think, well, you know, maybe there is a pitch where you think it's going to be inconsistent bounce and you just want a better wicket keeper there, or you want someone who's just better at stumping or moving their feet to the seam bowlers or whatever that may be. As a batter, yeah, I haven't seen enough of him so far to say that I think he's good enough. I was shocked when he was batting at 6 in the first innings of the first test. I think that was right, because I think he batted 6 once, unless I'm just making that up now. But I saw him as a number 7, or maybe he was listed at number 6. I saw him as a number 7 of the brief bits that I'd seen of him, and you look at his record, and he kind of profiles like a number 7 at test level. If he's a number 7 at test level, because you have Jadeja, that gives you enough flexibility that it doesn't really matter. But when Jadeja's injured, that's an issue, I think, going forward. But I don't think he's a good enough wicket keeper to displace Rishabh Pant ever from that side. Although maybe one day they want to free Rishabh Pant and just let him play as a batter. We've certainly seen with Brendan McCullum, Kumar Sangakkara, is it Walcott? Weeks? I always get confused which one was the wicket keeper. There's too many. There was actually too many W's born in Barbados by the same midwife. But yeah, I think from that perspective, we've seen a couple of players who are just elite level batters become a lot better when they give up the gloves. Statistically, Amal Dese and I looked it up once, and we couldn't find any difference in first class cricket of using the gloves and not using the gloves. But in Test cricket, there does seem to be more of a difference, although it's from such a small sample size that it's really hard to know. And the other thing is, a lot of those guys, if you look at McCullum and Sangakkara, when they gave up the gloves, they were actually reaching their peak batting years, of experience and skill level, which means that, of course, there was going to be a jump up in their average. There would have been even if they've kept the gloves. So it's even trickier to work out those sorts of things. But yeah, I haven't seen enough of him so far. I think he looks pretty tidy. A couple of times when he feels a little snatchy at the ball for someone who's such a obviously good wicketkeeper, but that could be nerves, early on in his career. It's one of the weird things about when someone is more of a specialist wicketkeeper, when they come through, any mistake they make, everyone goes, oh, might as well just pick the guy who could bat. And it's like, well, the guy who could bat might come in his first Test match and get rolled for no runs, right? Like these things all, just because you're a specialist doesn't mean that you're going to be absolutely impeccable at your special skill from the first game you play. You still got to be nervous. Ian Healy's nickname was Ian Healy, and I can't remember now, but Ian Healy wasn't very good in his first couple of games. Matt Pryor was terrible in Sri Lanka, right? And those sorts of players got better. SSBI says, if for some reason Sri Lanka qualifies for the World Test Championship, do you think the ICC will change up how the standings are calculated? So for those who don't know, I wrote before, or made a video actually before the series, the World Test Championship, saying that essentially Sri Lanka had the easiest schedule. I think that's right. It was them or Pakistan. I think it was Sri Lanka. And that if Sri Lanka had been in slightly better form, that you would have said that they should make the final. And of course, at that point, Sri Lanka was a bit of a shit show. So no one was expecting that to happen. And they've played well. They've got some good wins in very favorable series, if we're being honest. And the way New Zealand's currently playing, Sri Lanka has still got a chance of coming home. But your bigger question is, will the ICC change up how the standings are calculated? I don't know. Probably. But it's such a flawed, stupid system that I'm not sure there is a perfect system for it, unless you actually make everyone play each other more often, or you have divisions, which would be the other way of doing it. But at the moment, it looks like, depending on what the schedule is, one team is going to be, there's going to be a couple of teams who are going to have very, very friendly schedules and a couple of teams that won't. Now, having said that, I don't think Australia are that far away from qualifying, and they had a tougher schedule. I think that's right. Certainly for them, because did they have Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and India? So traditionally, they'd probably rather go and play in New Zealand and South Africa and the West Indies, right? So you could still be a good team and overcome that. But it does feel that the fact that I picked New Zealand, India last time, and Sri Lanka was the team that I thought had the easiest schedule this time, does say that your schedule seems to have a bigger impact on whether you're going to qualify than anything else. And if that's the case, then it's a stupid system, right? And all schedules are biased, right? Like, it's very, very rare that you have a situation where any kind of schedule in sport is completely fair. But this one is, it's not, it's not a World Test Championship. It's just a bunch of series that happen to be played that we call a World Test Championship at the end. And, good luck to Sri Lanka for making that. Huge thanks to everyone for coming on again and asking your questions. Remember, you can find Bharat on Twitter or on social media and absolutely rip into him. I don't know how many episodes he's lost. Someone can do the stats on me for that. Maybe they can point it out to him as well. But big thanks to everyone for coming up in the chat with some great questions there. And I will. What's next? Oh, England New Zealand series rolls on, doesn't it? So I'll be covering that next week. Maybe I should have a little bit more time to watch some more women's cricket as well as we get around to the finals aspect. We've got some really cool videos. I'm doing one on Neil Wagner, which is it's kind of a bit dodgy for me to go back and do a Neil Wagner video, right? After covering Neil Wagner for so long. Also in that original video that probably is why half of you are on this YouTube page to begin with. But yeah, I've got a Neil Wagner video. Got another couple of videos on the women's World Cup, which is really interesting. We've got 2 videos on Ravage Asia that we're currently in pre-production. So hey, if you're a Ravage Asia fan, come on board for those. But there's plenty of content coming up, and I will see you again for Wagon Wheel at the end of the week. And yeah, if you don't know how to find Bharat on Twitter, just try and track him down in the street and go, how about an episode of Uncovered? We'll see you next time.